So today is obviously the last day of April. How crazy is that, right? I cannot believe that this is actually, we're at this point right now. But I am super, super excited because obviously Rosé is awesome. I don't know if there's anyone here who doesn't like Rosé. Obviously there shouldn't be because you probably wouldn't be on this webinar anyway. Thank you all very, very much for being here and for coming. Cheers, everyone. So what do we got? Who's drinking what? But I will start off by saying that I am drinking this really, really freaking awesome rosé right now. This is the 2018 Domaine Tempier Bandol Rosé. Stellar. Pretty excited about it. So hi, guys. Mwah. Thank you so much. And you know what? We're just going to go ahead and get started. Beautiful. Et voilà, voilà, et voilà, et rosé. So this is our presentation on rosé. It is quite the season. If they haven't already, I don't know how many people are out shopping for wine right now, but they're pretty much going to start like hitting the shelves. If you're in California, like most of us are, you see them pretty much year round, but this is really the season where this year, this vintage is starting to come out and hit all the shelves. Normally we would be having our rosé soirée sometime around now. Unfortunately, we can't do that at the moment, but this today will be our little rosé soirée amongst you all. So we're gonna talk about it. And it's interesting because I think that rosé, my first introduction to rosé, I feel like I've always enjoyed it, but when I started learning more about it, I realized there was so much more to it than what I was really able to understand. And now, obviously, I feel much better. I feel like I get to know a little bit more about that, which is really fun. And I'm going to share that with you guys, too. So starting off, what is rosé? So rosé is what we're all drinking right now, or not all of us, but some of us. So rosé is wine that is pink. It's that easy. There you go, seminar over. But so rosés are wines that are pink in color as opposed to being your standard red wines or your white wines. And the whole point of this is what we're gonna go through today, kind of the process about how it's made and where it comes from and kind of what the different styles are like so that you can pick out the ones that you like the best. But most likely all of you have had rosé or are familiar with rosé because you literally cannot get away from it. The just surge of popularity that rosé has had in the past several years, even more than that, like 5 to 7 or so, it's insane. There was a statistic that I found where you know, there's been a 10% increase in global production between 2002 and 2011, and that was like the oldest statistic that I could find. But between 2011 and 2020, for example, I mean, I can't even imagine how many fold over the sales, the production. There are places that would never have imagined making rosé that are now standard issue for any winemaker anywhere. Just you have to put out a rosé because it's that popular. Is it a bubble? I don't know. Judge for yourself. But the fun thing about rosé, so rosé is an old style of wine. There's no reason it's any different than white wine or red wine. When you think about it, it's really just in how it's made. And I came across a fun fact, which is that they consider the origins of rosé to be sometimes during ancient Greece, which is really kind of when you think about the origin of wine in general. So we're going all the way back there. But there was a rumor that potentially rosé was created because in Greece, at the time, they were watering down the wine a little bit to prevent arguments in sort of political situations. But most likely, the situation for those rosés was just that they weren't macerating the grapes as long as we do today. And that's a whole part of the process that we're going to talk about when it comes to making rosé. Because rosé's been around more formally as early as the Middle Ages. Bordeaux is known for a very specific style of rosé that we'll talk about as well, that was shipped off to England. But overall, rosés are kind of wines that are made and drank and originate a lot of times in warm climates, because as we know, these are wines that are served chilled. They are refreshing. They tend to be just really satisfying and quenching. And so they're perfect for the summertime, for the beach, for any of those beautiful coastal areas, for example, like California that we live in, or any time that you're in sort of a place that's warm. It's just a very quenching and refreshing kind of beverage to have. And then rosés are made from red grapes. So before I go too much further, there's always exceptions, of course, but the majority of rosés that we drink are really based on red varietals, and obviously that is because there's color in them. And as we talk about, white grapes do not really have color. Now, there is a whole other category of rosés that are made from pink-skinned grapes. These would be sort of Gris varietal grapes, like your Pinot Gris, where vinification is done with contact in those skins, and you're going to get a very, very light rosé because it's all about the pigmentation in the skin of the grapes. So again, we'll kind of talk about that, but really today we're focusing on your classic rosés, which are really fundamentally made with red grapes. And really, rosés as a category are just, it's a huge category. It can be, and we all know this from shopping around and from tasting rosés, just ordering rosé does not define what you're getting in your glass. So there's the whole color range from the very, very palest of the pale to the deepest of the pink. And then there's the sweetness range. There's the whole idea of how dry it is, how minerally or how technically sweet it is if there's a lot of residual sugar in it. So rosé as a category covers all of those ranges, which makes it can make it very challenging to pick out which one that you're drinking. But hopefully we'll help you with that today. So most importantly, what defines rosé is how it's made. And as I mentioned, it is the color of the rosé is extracted from the skins of the grapes through a minimal amount of skin contact. And this is generally done through something called maceration. So maceration, if anyone cooks or makes desserts, you're familiar with the idea of basically letting something sit in its liquid. So this is before fermentation when it comes in the lineup of how you make wine. Maceration in this particular case is coming before fermentation. So the yeasts haven't started changing any of the sugars into alcohol yet. Really what you're doing is just allowing the juice to have skin contact with the grapes. And the timing of that is really, really essential. So when we talk about the different methods, in particular, it's really dependent on the grape that you're using. We know for example, that different grapes have different amounts of anthocyanins in their skin, which is the coloring pigmentation that you'll see. For example, Pinot Noir versus Malbec. Two very, very differently colored grapes, where you're seeing Pinot Noir as being kind of a lighter skin grape, which is going to have less coloring to impart into your wine through maceration, and deeper colored grapes like Malbec or like Cabernet Sauvignon, where you have more of those anthocyanins, more of the coloring. That's going to be extracted more into the wine, the rosé, the longer it's in contact with the skin. So the timing of this is dependent A, on what kind of rosé the winemaker wants to make, and B, what kind of varietal they're using to make their rosé. So lighter skins, you can do a little bit longer. Darker skins tend to take a little less time. But the key to rosés, generally speaking, there's always exceptions, but the key to the rosé is that this maceration happens, like I said, before fermentation. So in all cases, the wine is removed from the skins before fermentation begins. So I should say the juice, the grape must, is separated from the skins themselves, and then fermentation begins to turn it into wine. So that is part of the process of making rosé. Starts like a red wine, ends like a white wine. The two main methods that we're going to cover today, because they're really the most common, and pretty much every rosé, 99.9% that you're going to come across on your daily rosé drinking all day, is going to be one of these two methods, and most likely even the first. So these are direct press and Sagnier Method, and we'll cover those in the next couple of slides. And then the important thing to know is that taking, for example, red wine and pouring it into your white wine to make a rosé is not really allowed. So just in case there was any question about that, really pretty much across the board in old world countries and in most regulated winemaking areas, it is illegal to blend your red wine and your white wine to make a rosé. It has to be done without the blending. It has to be done before that fermentation process. Now, there are exceptions, of course, to this as well. One of the most famous that we'll talk about is in Champagne, where blending is a very typical and more commonly used method for making rosés. and other parts of the world too, especially in the New World, and in some lesser quality categories, you know, obviously you can, where there's no regulations, no one's going to stop you. But generally speaking, it is frowned upon and not considered quite as good quality. So the direct press method, now this again is going to be the most common method that you're going to see these days because it produces a style of wine that has become really the focus of the popularity of the consumer taste and the consumer preference right now, we'll say. But direct press is pretty much what it sounds like. So you take the grapes, whatever you're using to make your rosé, be it Grenache Merveille Cinsault, be it Tempranillo, and you take those grapes, you put them into the press, and then you allow maybe a little bit of a crush to release some juices, and you let those juices macerate on those skins for anywhere from 8 to 12 hours or even up to 2 days. This maceration can last, depending again on the varietal and on the pigmentation that the winemaker is going for and the amount of tannins that they also want to pull out along with that color. But this again all happens sort of in a cooler temperature so that fermentation does not start. And then after that maceration time, these are directly pressed. The juice, the must, is drawn off and vinified like a white wine, as we mentioned. So this is the method that produces your lighter colored rosés. This very, very typical, what we tend to call Provence style in particular, because that's really sort of the homeland, if you will, for this dry, pale style of rosé, Provence in France, southern France. And you've got generally lighter skinned grapes that are used for this, again, because the goal is really to minimize the amount of color, to get that pale salmon or that pale pink. And this is the visual definition of direct press. Now, it's important to know that it's very easy to overshoot these times. The direct press does mean that you have to be very, very conscious of how long those wines are macerating. We had a wonderful rosé of Pinot Noir from Cardwell Hill up in Oregon, for example. From year to year, the colors change dramatically from sort of a deeper pink hue to a lighter pink hue. And I think the difference for maceration time for him was just an hour. So it can come down to that amount of time where it really, really can make a big difference visually speaking, if not so much even on the flavor profile of the backbone. But you have to be aware of that. It's very easy to overshoot your direct press if you're not paying full attention. Once these wines are drawn off, or the juices are drawn off and fermented, you're looking at really stainless steel for the most part. Very few rosés are vinified in oak barrels. Of course, again, there are always exceptions, but when we think about rosé, think about the idea of it is defined by being fresh, being fruity, having a lightness to it. And that is what we use stainless steel for. You don't want that interference of any kind of spice or flavor from the oak to interfere with the freshness and the fruitiness that you're going to get from rosé. So typically, the majority of rosés that you get are going to be vinified in stainless steel after fermented and vinified in stainless steel. So these wines, again, this is pretty much what you see on the shelf. This is the consumer preference of the time right now. And the direct press method is probably, I would say, like 80% of what is out there at the moment. So now here's our little, the redheaded stepchild of rosé at the moment, so to speak, because it is also deeper in color. But the Sagnier method, I think sometimes it gets a bad rap because people don't necessarily understand what to expect from it. So Sagnier, the fun part about this, of course, is that the word Sagnier comes from the French word to bleed. It means bleeding. So, and that is really, again, the method, the sort of origin and definition of this method itself. Basically, when it first started, there's someone who wanted to make red wine, who is making red wine already. And they said, hey, I really need this wine to be more concentrated. How can I do that? Well, if I reduce the amount of juice in contact with the skins, then there's a higher concentration of anthocyanins that are getting pulled into that juice because of that ratio. And how can I do that? Well, if I bleed off some of my red wine that I'm currently macerating, then I create that concentration. I sort of up that intensity in my red wine. And as a result, I sort of have this leftover deep pink wine, or deep pink juice, I should say. So instead of just throwing that juice away, someone said, hey, you know what? Why don't we just make wine out of it? Because, hey, what could go wrong? And thus you have Sagnier Method Rosé. Now, while this concept is really originally conceived as a byproduct of red wine making, it is far and away no longer the case as the norm. There are actually very many places that use this method specifically and intentionally. As is mentioned, and you can see in this picture right here, Tavel is a cru in the Southern Rhone, and they only make 100% Sagnier Method Rosé. And they're very proud of it, and they're excellent rosés. They're great examples, if you've never had a Sagnier Method Rosé, of what this style is epitomized to be. Traditionally, these juices, the juice and also the wine, as a result, you can see is much, much deeper in color than you get with direct press. So this is where you're getting to your deep roses, your deep pinks, and almost to like a lighter red wine in some cases, depending on how deeply macerated these wines, the juices are before you're making them into wine. And there's a couple of things that happen with this extended skin contact, all right? You're already getting a little bit more color, obviously, out of it, in some cases a lot more color, and you're also getting some more of the tannin out of it. So this means that the resulting wines are gonna have a little bit more structure to them. You're gonna start to see a difference when you're drinking them. They're gonna feel weightier, they're gonna feel a little bit fuller bodied, and they actually are gonna age longer because they have more of the aging capabilities that are provided with the antioxidants in the tannins and the anthocyanins. So these wines can be very, very austere, very, very elegant, and very, very intense, but also delicious. And traditionally, it's important to note that these wines are still vinified to dryness. Again, it's not a determining factor. I think the trickiest part about rosé is that, again, the sweetness level, right? You don't know, based on color, how much residual sugar is going to be in that wine, to be perfectly honest. Just because it's the palest of the pale doesn't mean it's not going to have any residual sugar. And just because it's very, very deep and pink is no indication that it's a sweet wine. So that's, I think, where it gets into trouble right now. No, the wines in Tavel are bottled as Tavel. So they're Tavel AOCs. So that is specifically, it's not Côte d'Aron, it is Tavel. And so they're very, very specific to that, which is wonderful. So it's easy to find, easy to identify. And then in the red wines, do you know what? I think they would just be Côte d'Aron, yes. That is a good question, Nancy, but I'm pretty sure outside of Tavel, if it's not in Tavel, if it's not the rosés, sorry. Yes, it is then just bottled under your regular Côte d'Aron, sort of declassified. So in addition to that, we've got, these Sagnier Method rosés are definitely considered kind of your red wine drinker rosés. So if you do like red wine, then you would probably really enjoy a Tavel rosé as well. So Sarah is asking, how can I tell which way my rosé was made? This is a really great question, and it's hard to know. But generally speaking, you're going to be looking at the color. So like I said, a majority of the rosés that are made that are on the market today are pretty much done with a short maceration or through direct press. So minimal skin contact to give you that lighter color. And if it's anything, basically, if you see in the picture that's in the slide, that is going to be your Sagnier Method. You're looking at a pretty deeply colored rosé in order to make it a Sagnier Method. Where it gets complicated and where some places do this, you can, as a winemaker, choose to use both processes and blend them together, meaning that some of it is direct press and some of it is Sagnier Method, which could result in sort of a mixed color and also a very complex mouthfeel and palate. But generally speaking, again, if we're talking in broad terms, in broad strokes, if it's a lighter color, it's direct press. And then if it's a deeper color, it's going to be a Sagnier Method, because there's just no way to get a light color with Sagnier. So in addition, Marcus, did I say that Sagnier is made from the leftovers of red wine production? That was the origin of Sagnier Method. Yes, that's the sort of the concept, original, if you will, of Sagnier. But like I said, at this point, it's been recognized pretty much as a bona fide and very well-respected form of making rosé. So these are our two main methods for making rosé, but I wanted to share a few different styles and terms that you might see when you're looking for rosé that can also help you figure out which way it was made, right? So for example, vin gris. Vin gris is a French term that actually means gray wine. Gris is gray in French, so sounds really not pleasant, but it's actually quite delicious. So vin gris is a way of basically making rosé with direct press method that has minimal to no maceration time. So when I was talking about direct press and saying traditionally we're looking at like between 8 and 12 hours, let's say, For Vin Gris, we're looking at really, you're putting the grapes into the press and you just start pressing really slowly. And then whatever wine, whatever skin contact that juice gets as you're pressing it is basically all the color that comes out into the finished wine. So these are kind of the palest of the pale of rosés, your Vin Gris. And they have to be made via direct press. So anytime you see that on a label, that's technically what it means, although the term itself is not regulated, I should say. So there's no legal verification for that, but using the term Gris in the wine, for example, actually, Bonnie Doon up in Santa Cruz, they've got their Gris de Cigar, right? And that's technically, they're referencing this Vin Gris method as a stylistic choice to kind of share with people what their intentions are with the wine. But Vin Gris, that's what it means, the lightest color rosés you can get. Rosé Champagne, as I mentioned before, this is one of the very, very few regions where it's acceptable and actually more common to see blending as opposed to either of the press methods for making rosé. Really, it's part logistically because when you get into traditional methods, sparkling wines, the process of making the wine is a little bit more complicated. So allowing for that blending process gives you more flexibility and more control over the out product. Of course, when you're blending, you have to be very careful about what you're adding because you cannot technically take away color without, filtering the wine through charcoal or something like that. But you've got a lot of times in Champagne, what they'll do is they'll actually add the red wine to the dosage, which is the final element of the process. This is the final step, I should say, in the process of traditional method sparkling winemaking. It's where they add also the sweetness level. So what goes into the bottle just before it is capped and corked and sealed. They'll add just the touch of the red wine into that part of it to give it the appropriate amount of color that they're looking for in a consistent way across the board with their production. This is a fun one. So as I was mentioning before, Bordeaux had a very famous rosé wine in the Middle Ages that was called Claret, which is not to be mistaken for Claret. So Claret was actually a deeply colored rosé wine that was often exported to England. And consequently, the English then sort of adapted the name Claret to reference red wines from Bordeaux further on. So oftentimes that's what you'll hear. To get them confused is very easy, obviously, because the spelling is very close. But ultimately, the Claret is going to be your deeply colored rosé from Bordeaux, and then Claret is just a reference point for red wine that the English kind of came up with and that they use. Another Claret, and then also a fun one, Schillerwein. These are wines from Spain and Germany, respectively. These are special. So both of these styles are essentially rosés that are made by co-fermentation. So this is a completely different method that we didn't talk about, but this means that in this Cigales region in Spain, and then also in the Württemberg region of Germany, which is sort of to the south and just a little bit east of Baden. Both of these regions are very well known for making rosés by taking red grapes and white grapes, putting them together in the fermentation vat, and letting the fermentation happen with both styles, with both grapes together. And this creates a very different style of rosé, obviously, because you are getting skin contact from both the red grapes and the white grapes. So in Spain, it's referred to as the Claret method, and in Germany, it's referred to as the Schillerwein from Württemberg. And actually the Schillerwein and the Württemberg Schillerwein, I should say, is part of a larger category in Germany called Rotling, and only made in various small parts, but the Württemberg one is really kind of the most prominent. But again, this is special because it's about co-fermentation of the grapes and not about the pressing method or blending. Blush wines, I'm sure many of us are familiar with this. It is a very American concept and wine, if you will. So the most famous being, of course, white Zinfandel, but it is not limited to white Zinfandel. It is also, it's basically the idea of making a white wine from red grapes, kind of. So the origin of blush wines was really a concept that was brought about in the 1970s, because at that point, there was a huge demand for white wines in the United States. Everyone just started drinking white wine. And there actually wasn't enough, grapes, there wasn't enough wine to supply. So as a result, winemakers in California went to the idea of making white wine from red grapes. And you have the Sorry, I was just reading Kathy's question here. How can you tell if it's a dry or sweet rosé? This is the challenge. Part of it, I think, really what you need to do is looking at the alcohol content is always a good sign of knowing how much residual sugar is in the wine. The lower the alcohol content, the more likelihood that there is going to be some residual sugar in the wine. So if you look at an average rosé, it should be probably around 12%. Yes, exactly. The lower the alcohol content, generally the sweeter. So if it's around 12%, you're looking at probably a dry wine, most likely. When you get down to, like, if it says 10% or less, you're going to be seeing a lot of more residual sugar in there. And anything over 12% for a rosé is really, you're getting up there. It'll be a little warm. At that point, you might have very, very ripe grapes that you're dealing with, which could mean any number of things that you could actually ferment it to a certain alcohol and then still have residual sugar left over. But one of the things that's good to know when we talk about where wines are from is that way it'll help you kind of understand. Some places you kind of know just because of where it's made that it's going to be dry. But going back to the blush wines, in the 1970s, the demand for white wine, and that came out with White Zinfandel or Cabernet Blanc or Merlot Blanc. And 13.5 is still okay, Angela. I'm talking when you get into like the 15s or 16s or something like that. I don't think I've ever seen a rosé that high, but they definitely probably exist. But yes, 13.5, you should definitely be dry. Basically in the 70s, the most famous White Zinfandel was really not necessarily intended to be sweet, but what happened was that Sutter Home, I'm sure we're all familiar with Sutter Home, they basically marketed a batch of wine, pink wine that came out, they made from Zinfandel. So it was the Zinfandel, the White Zinfandel of fame, and it was the result of a stuck fermentation. So what that means is that basically while the wine was fermenting, the yeast just got tired or for whatever reason stopped turning the alcohol into sugar, which meant that it created a low alcohol wine that had a lot of residual sugar in it. And Sutter Home just decided to release it, and it became a big hit, and it really set the standard for what White Zinfandel and sort of blush wines are. And unfortunately, I think that has been kind of the predominant reference point in American understanding of rosé wines for a very long time. Today, in these past several years, as rosé is becoming so popular and much more accepted and much so widespread, I think that a lot of people are no longer really referencing that quite so much. But the term blush doesn't necessarily mean that it's sweet, but it tends to reference that category of historical rosé wines that were made in the United States. And then the last one, which I just think is really fun, you don't see this a lot, but it's just a term that comes up, which is huile de perdrix, which is basically French for partridge's eye. And this is a very specific type of rosé made from Pinot Noir. And it's just a tasting term. It's very pale rosés, and usually referencing pale pink rosés of Pinot Noir that are made in Switzerland. So just a fun fact and a fun thing to say. Huile de perdrix, in case you're into French speaking. So moving on to where rosé comes from. At this point, honestly, it really comes from everywhere, like I mentioned. Classically or traditionally non-rosé countries, if you will, or regions like Italy. Italy is not traditionally a rosé drinking country or making country, honestly. They really focus on their reds, and then they do have a lot of whites as well. But in past years, I mean, to not make a rosé right now puts you at a disadvantage in the market. So literally everybody is coming up with different rosés and to have a rosé in their lineup somewhere. So really rosé kind of comes from everywhere, but traditionally, and most importantly, I would say France is probably our reference point for rosé, and for good reason, because France is actually responsible for about 27% of all rosé made in the world comes from France. I mean, that's a lot. So to say that French rosé is going to be your benchmark go-to is a pretty realistic expectation. Does that mean that all French rosé is dry? Of course not. But the most popular style, as I mentioned, is the Provence style, south of France, dry, pale, direct press rosés. In Provence, you've got the Bandol, which I have, a smaller region, but very, very highly regarded region. One of the largest places that you'll find these dry styles of rosé is Côte de Provence. So you see that on the label. That is going to be your classic south of France dry style rosé. It's a great way to look for that if that's the kind that you like. Seeing Côte de Provence or Provence anywhere on the label, honestly. Aix-en-Provence is another fairly large producing region, but Côte de Provence actually produces 75% of all wine in Provence. So it's a pretty heavy hitter and a pretty fairly easy one to find if that's the style that you like. However, as we mentioned, of course, there are plenty of other places in France, Tavel, which we talked about with the Sagnier method, and I can't leave this without referencing the Loire Valley as well. So Dawn, wondering, so Provence is the larger region of France and Bandol is within Provence. So Bandol is its own AOC. So you have to go through the hierarchy of how they define those regions in France specifically. But if you think about Bandol, it is kind of like our AVA in the sense that it's a geographically delineated area that is within the larger geographic area of Provence. Does that make sense? I'm sure it does. So yes, it is a little bit smaller. But Loire Valley is huge by comparison, of course, and they do make rosés across the board as well. Definitely in sort of the upper Loire area where you have Sancerre. Sancerre we all know for Sauvignon Blanc and white wines, but you have beautiful, beautiful Pinot Noir rosés because that's their red wine. That's their red grape of Sancerre. If you like Sancerre as a white wine, the Sancerre rosés are dry, mineral driven, just really, really elegant and really kind of racy, beautiful wines. I highly encourage you to find them. There's also another region in there called Reuilly. And this, Sandra, I know, just in case you're interested, this is actually a rosé that's made from Pinot Gris because that's their main varietal there. So again, this is a white, or technically a pink-skinned grape that they use that maceration to pull the color out. Very, very pale. But again, you have a beautiful minerality, lots of acidity, and it's just a really, really excellent rosé that's technically made from a pink/white grape, if you will. And then when you get into the terrain, that sort of the middle vineyards or the center Loire area, that is where a lot of rosé production comes from. You've got, and ranging all over the place in terms of sweetness level as well. You've got kind of in Anjou in particular, there are two different kinds of rosés. There's Rosé d'Anjou and Cabernet d'Anjou, both of which are rosé wines and both of which have residual sugar in them. So those will always, as part of the definition of what they are, have to have some RS and have a little bit of sweetness to them. And then there is Rosé de Loire, which it would say on the label, and that is always a dry rosé. So it gets complicated, but these are also super exciting and interesting because they're made from Cabernet Franc usually, or local varietals like Grelot. And Pinot Noir, of course, and Pinot Dagny. These are fun, unique, lesser known varietals that go into the rosés and give them a beautiful kind of standout quality. Our second country that we're really going to talk about is Spain, because Spain is really into their rosés and they always have been. I mentioned the Cigales region that does the co-fermentation with the Claret, but also Navarra is historically a really, really wonderful, here they call it Rosado, of course, not just, they don't call it rosé, obviously, but the Rosados of Spain. And this you'll see Tempranillo and Garnacha used very commonly for the base materials for those rosés. Great grapes for that. They do a wonderful job with it. But also Cava. Cava is, if any of you are fans of Cava, you know there are rosé Cavas out there. And they use, as well as the Tempranillo and the Pinot Noir, you've got, and Garnacha, I'm sorry, they've got Pinot Noir is a very common red grape that's used in Cava. And there's also a wonderful local varietal called Trepat, T-R-E-P-A-T. And that is, that's a native Spanish varietal. It can only be used in rosé. I mean, you can make red still Trepat wine, but in Cava, it can only be used in the rosés. They can't press it to make it white like they do with Pinot Noir, for example. And Cava, just as a reference point, when we were talking about our methods, Cava has to be made via the Sagnier method. You can't use blending. So Rosé Cava is always a Sagnier method product. So very interesting, I think. So here we are, we're coming to the consensus of our talk, which is how do you drink rosé? It's very easy. You just put it in the glass and you drink it. But one of the wonderful things about rosé, and I think why it's such a huge popular hit, just globally speaking, it's versatile, it's really approachable, and it's really delicious. Especially your drier styles, you're getting refreshing acidity, you're getting a beautiful fruitiness, and you're just getting a lovely companion to a wide range of foods, for example. So I can't give you specifics because really it runs the gamut. You can have a rosé throughout your entire meal and be fully satisfied, from your cheese and charcuterie to your salads. The lightness and the acidity is really going to still pair well with vinaigrettes and things like that. Moving into your fishes, I mean, you can do sort of a vin gris to go with your delicate flakier fishes, and then you have deeper rosés that can go with salmons, and all the way to your tavels that can stand up to richer meats and porks, and heavier sauces. That is just, it has a great way of providing that refreshing, palate stimulating, cleansing quality, while also providing a flavor profile and a little bit more heft and weight that compare with fuller bodied dishes. Also, it's great for the pool and, the patio. Always, pretty much anytime. And then it is important to know the myth about rosé, that it can only be drunk in the year that so the vintages right now, I mentioned the 2019 vintages, that's your current vintage that's coming out right now. The majority of the rosé that comes out is meant to really drink within a year or two so far. It's not meant to hang on to, but it's not gonna go bad in a year, just so you know. I've had plenty of, 1-year-old rosés that are tasting just fine and will do the trick just as well. But generally speaking, it's not like you're gonna cellar these guys anyway, unless you get into those tavels, the bandoles, the sort of higher regarded and more, revered wines as well. Those are going to have a little bit more ageability. You can keep them for 5 years. They'll start to develop a candied kind of fruit note, not that they get sweeter, but simply that they're able to actually develop in the bottle. And most rosés are not made to develop, they're made to just enjoy. So that's why they usually say just drink it within the year. Just know if you have a 2018 or even a 2017, it's probably going to be just fine and you'll do okay. So that, my friends, is that. Voila, c'est la vie. So I am going to go ahead. I thank you guys. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. But I do want to say thank you. I went a little bit over today, but I'm glad you guys are all here and you stuck around. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, I appreciate you all. I'll send out the slides again, as always, in the thank you message. These are lovely to have you. If you do feel like donating, you're welcome to. There's a little button on the thank you messages. Can't tell you how grateful I am to have you all here, and it's awesome. Cheers. Cheers, cheers, cheers. Happy Rosé, everybody.
Cheers.
Happy April. Cheers. And happy rest of